Welcome to Animind, an anime podcast where we nerd out about all things anime and dive deeply into that storytelling art form while dissecting the psychological aspects that it speaks to. I'm one of your co-hosts, Matthew, aka the Conjuring Pen Basil.
I'm Danny Ari, cosplayer and writer and voice actor and whatever else.
And I'm Graham, and that's all I got to say about that.
This is a brand new podcast for victims and villains, all about anime. We're basically going to look at the artistic aspects of the storytelling medium. That's very definable, so there's a lot to talk about there. We're going to look at a different series or movie each episode and just dive in to what is presented there. And we're going to talk about the psychological aspects because this is a victims and villains podcast. So we're going to look at the mental health themes that are discussed and what the characters bring and can speak to the human condition. So, but first, I think since this is our first episode, I think we, have to discuss what is it that makes anime so special? Whether you love it or, hate it or think it's weird or whatever, it's definitely very recognizable. It makes an impression on people. It has a strong, very passionate and tightly knit fan base community throughout the world. I mean, not just America and Japan, obviously, but on all countries throughout Europe and such. So what do you two think? What is, as anime fans, what is it about this storytelling form that really speaks to people and really makes people passionate?
You want to go ahead, Danny?
Sure. So I personally have always been pretty interested in anime and the art form. I started reading manga when I was in, I think, 7th grade. And then I got into the anime club at the tail end of that, and there was just kind of no looking back. The reason I always appreciated it was because it was something different, because, you get not only a piece of media that isn't from America, a lot of the times, especially back in the 90s, you're getting something that I think culturally is different than what we were raised on, and it's kind of eye-opening, especially when you're young and you're like, wow, this is different than anything I've ever experienced. So I've always found that really fascinating. And as I've gotten older, I started drawing and all kinds of stuff. So it was just really entertaining for more than one reason. And now I want to do voice acting. So it's kind of, my whole life has kind of been influenced heavily by anime and all of that.
I also have a similar experience to Danny. I got into anime fairly early. I'm trying to remember how old I was, probably like 8. One of my close family friends, who is basically my godmother, is actually Japanese, and I remember one day she brought over a copy of My Neighbor Totoro, and that was the first exposure to anime I ever had. And she had all the other Studio Ghibli movies, so that was kind of my gateway drug into the medium. And I started getting into manga and anime on my own when I was probably about 11. And the first manga I read was Yu Yu Hakusho, and it's just been that way since. But like Danny said, it's been, for me, probably, it's just so different, and kind of the influences and background and a lot of anime is drawn from is something unique and doesn't come from the same cultural foundation as like what we have, just because there's a lot of that Eastern background and religion that it's steeped in that's just something so different from what we grew up on, and makes it really unique and alluring.
Yeah, now I got to come clean here to the listeners. I am not as anywhere near as well versed as they are in anime. I'm actually very new to the medium. So if you're listening and you're kind of just starting to put your toe in the water for anime, you're with me here. So you're along with the ride for me. They're my guides into the world of anime and manga. It always has been knocking at my door. I'm a nerd, so it was always around me, but I didn't really get much exposure to it until I was in college. My college roommate, when I was in film school, he would put on Adult Swim at night while we, just put on the background while he was on his laptop. And as I was doing my thing, either on my laptop or getting ready for bed or whatnot, I would get sucked in to these anime shows. I'd be like, what is this? What is it? What is this character? Oh my God. Like, it spoke to something that was a lot deeper for me as a filmmaking student. I look for the messages of stories and the art form, and how it reflects the human condition. And to me, anime spoke to something that was a lot deeper than what I was normally used to seeing in a lot of the Western mediums that I got exposed to. They would graze the surface. Some of them would go deeper. I'm not saying there isn't deep movies and TV shows and stuff and books in the West, but anime to me just seemed like it would just go to those deep places. And it was like you both said, very unique in the fact that it kind of had new spins on how to approach those themes. So that interested me a great deal, but I was very busy in film school, and I just never got around to it. So when Victims and Villains wanted to start having an anime podcast, I was more than happy to volunteer to be a part of that. And that's why, I'm here now.
One thing that makes anime interesting, especially from like a Western perspective, is because in the West, animation is considered, oh, that's for kids.
Yes.
And then anime, like when you watch it and then you're like, oh, this is not like necessarily for children. Like it kind of throws you for a loop, and then you get that kind of different cultural background on top of that. And then you're like, oh, this is not at all what I was expecting. Like there's something interesting here that I want to keep seeing what this is about. Like, what's going on?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head too, because I'm a huge fan of animation in general. I'm going to date myself here so you can figure out my age. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was my life as a child.
Yeah.
Okay. And I was always drawn, like I said, to the nerd community, but I always had a special place in my heart for animation, maybe because I just watched cartoons nonstop when I was a kid. Looney Tunes, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, G.I. Joe, Transformers, any cartoon I could find. And I remember being always drawn when the cartoons had an adult theme. Like I watched Batman the Adam West series when I was a kid. And I like Batman. My dad bought me, Batman trading cards and stuff when I was a kid. He would bring them home from work. But I didn't really fall in love with that character until I saw Batman the Animated Series. Yep. And I saw him hanging above a skyscraper saying, I am vengeance, I am the night, I am Batman. And I was like, whoa, okay. So I do think there is something about, like you said, Graham, that cartoons being so, pigeonholed as a children's medium. And then this, when you have these adult themes and it can go places, live action sometimes misses. And we talked about this when we talked about Akira. How like that level of violence would have never been able to really hold, I think, as much of an audience if it was live action, but it was used in such an artful way in that movie.
Yeah, one of the things that most drew me in, especially as I got older, a lot of people I knew were starting to like grow out of the whole anime thing, like, it's okay, like I'm gonna start falling in love with this type of art. But like, I think one thing that was specifically intriguing to me about anime was the art in general, the art form. It's not something you see, well, at least not in the 90s and early 2000s, something that you'd see like on, Channel 5. I mean, eventually it was the kind of thing where, we're getting Pokemon, we're starting to get Sailor Moon, we're starting to get, all of these things that we grew up on. But before that, it was just such an unexplored territory, I think. And just the excitement of, like, I'm going to give an example for anybody who watches a lot of anime, Studio Trigger. Like, they've done a lot of different things, and we'll be getting into something later on that they've done. But the art and the way they use colors and the way they use, just in general is just, it's incredible to me. And I guess that's something that I'm really excited to talk about in the future, because the Astro Boy we watched was all black and white. So there's not a lot of color, not a lot of, super exciting artwork. It's a lot more basic when it comes to art, but the ideas behind it are a lot heavier, I think.
Which, speaking of which, that's a good segue into what we're going to talk about in this episode, which is Astro Boy, which was the 1963 anime, which is black and white, which I'm sorry, sounds like it was very painful for you, Danny, to watch a black and white anime from 1963. So I apologize, but it was the first anime, really. Animation existed in Japan well before 1963, of course, but it was the first time that a lot of the techniques and styles and visuals that are key to anime today were used. They were used by, and I'm sorry, you guys can correct me because I'm going to butcher his name, Osamu Tezuka.
Yeah, Osamu Tezuka. Yeah.
There you go. I got it right. Okay, thank you. He was like a prolific manga creator. And like all his life wrote manga.
In Japan, like even to this day, because of his influence and because of like him being kind of the first one who is attributed to creating what is now known today as like the first anime, he is called in Japan the god of anime.
Yeah, I was about to say he is known as the god of anime because he, like I said, he created all these techniques. And the funny thing, I when I was doing research for this episode, is that he did it because he started working with animation studios. It did not work out well when he was working for animation studios. He didn't like he felt he didn't have the creative control he wanted over the stories. They didn't like the way he worked because he was used to working with manga, and so his style and how he was giving them the storyboards didn't work out for them. So it was kind of a failure. One of his creations, Astro Boy, was actually going to be made into a live action series. You can actually find some test shots on YouTube still of that, but it failed. But he still believed in the idea, and he decided to make his own animation studio, basically. So he had to cut cost and cut time and labor and all that to make it work, because he was kind of cobbling this together. So he took Disney animation techniques, which he was very heavily influenced by Disney, and he basically kind of shortchanged them and all. So he used pans, and zooms. He recycled footage. He did reverse footage. The voiceover, the animation first and then the voice afterwards, which is the opposite of the way it's done in the West, where they do the voice first and then the animation sync it up. So he did all that stuff to cut costs to make it easier, and it all became a new art form, became a new style, became anime, which I think is really cool. And even I read, and I'm not sure if this is correct, so someone out there can correct me if I'm wrong, but I even read that the little points on Astro Boy's head are in reference to Mickey Mouse's ears. They're homage to Mickey Mouse's ears.
Where no matter what way he's turning, it's like the points on his head will still be going the same way.
Yep, you can always see them.
Considering like the humble origins of Astro Boy, all the kind of technical issues that they had to find creative workarounds with, is the fact that Osamu Tezuka was not originally someone who worked in animation or art. I believe he was originally a physician who just liked drawing, and then that's how he got into becoming animator and creator we know him as today. So from a physician to the god of anime, that's quite a field change.
That being said, if depending on which series you watch, it makes a lot of sense. I actually didn't know that part, but it makes a lot of sense to, I guess, the idea behind Astro Boy and I guess what shapes the whole storyline. And I feel like that it's very telling. If you would have told me, oh yeah, this is a doctor that created this, I'd be like, you know what, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because they have basically, for those that are unfamiliar with Astro Boy, the 1963 version, because as we found out, the 2003 version is a little different. It takes a little different spin on some things, but the 1963 version is basically about a future Japan where robots are commonplace, and a scientist who works at what's it called? Like the future something.
The Department of Science, I think.
There you go.
I think he's the head of the Department of Science, Dr. Tenma.
Yeah, he then loses his son in a car accident because apparently in the future children can ride in cars down streets at high speeds and be perfectly safe.
The future, year 2000, super crazy advance.
Well, in the 1981 that I saw, or that I also watched, when he gets in the car to ride off, he's by himself, and when Dr. Tenma finds out that he's left, he says, how could you let him have gotten away in a robot car, like by himself? Like that's not safe to drive. And
right? They like immediately highlighted that from the original. They're like, this isn't normal. We need to like address this, I think.
Yeah, because the original 1963 one, the voiceover specifically says it is perfectly safe to drive in the car.
Yeah, they basically drive themselves. It's the future, guys.
Yeah, and I felt like the whole 1980, like the origin story, which is like one episode in the 1963 version and like spread out into like 3 or 4 episodes in the 1980 version. But I felt like they were just trying to like make that origin story just a little cleaner and just make a little more sense, but keep everything there. But anyway, his son dies in a car accident. It's a tragedy that affects him, and he creates a robot to look like his son, to be a replacement son, and that's Astro Boy, who, and I don't know if anyone got this because I couldn't really figure it out. I saw 3 versions too, but none of them seem to explain it. Why to create a robot version of his son, I understand, but why he had to create a robot version of his son who was the most super advanced, deadliest robot in existence? Did anyone get that?
I don't think it's explained, but I think when I was looking at some YouTube comments when I was watching some stuff in preparation for this episode, someone asked that, like, so why did he need his replacement son to have like what is it, 500 or like 5,000 horsepower and like laser fingers and like a machine gun that comes out of his butt? Just
it's 1,000 horsepower. He's got like jets on his feet. And then the thing is, especially in the newest one that I watched in like 2000 something, like he adapts. So things that they didn't necessarily create him to have, they're like, oh, so his fingers come apart and they shoot missiles now? Wow. And he goes, wow, I can do this now. Like nobody, like this is scary as like someone who's in this century. I'm like, if robots just started advancing without us telling them to, that's terrifying. They're like, all of a sudden I can just blow stuff up. It's fine.
Yeah, what if that happened? That's crazy, huh?
Yeah, no wonder they were terrified. But sweetest kid, though.
I think I can't remember if it's in the theme song or if it was just a descriptor where they say that he's got a heart of gold.
Yeah, that's in the original theme song.
Yeah. It's
crazy when you watch the 60s version versus the other 2 versions. Like, the theme song is a lot more like it's very okay. So you think about the 60s and where we are in like American history. It's a lot about defending the people and fighting for the people and being the defender and the good, like, prevails over this or that, and it's very clear in the lyrics of the intro that it's just like, you can tell it's very 60s, like post World War II. We're trying to like get everybody, bring them all together. We're trying not to fear technology. Like, it's, when you place it in history, it makes a lot of sense, but it's watching it now, years and years later, it's kind of like almost blatantly obvious.
Astro Boy was actually the name that he received when he came to the West, because in Japan, his original name Mighty Atom, and
yes.
When he came to the West, they were thinking, well, when you think of Atom and something between Japan and America, the first thing you think of is the atom bomb, and we don't want you thinking about that, so we're just gonna call him Astro Boy, and that just kind of stuck.
Right. I noticed that actually in the translations. I accidentally had pulled up the Japanese 1963 version, and I was like, this doesn't even say Astro Boy on it. It just said something and then Atom, and I was like, Oh, and I looked it up, and it was like, it gave that whole history. I was like, oh, that's crazy.
And originally, the series that was kind of the predecessor for Astro Boy was another series, which was the original manga that Osamu Tezuka worked on in like 1951, 1952, and it was called Ambassador Adam. And Astro Boy wasn't even the main character, but he was the most popular character. And then from there, like one of the head guys at the magazine that he worked at, Shonen, the kids really like this character. What if you did something with that and like took it, like made it all about him? And then Mighty Atom was created, and the rest is history.
If you or someone you know is listening to this podcast right now and you're struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, we encourage you guys to please reach out. This is the heartbeat of why we do what we do. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and as of this recording, there are 132 suicides that take place each and every day on American soil. And when you scale back internationally, there are 800,000 successful suicides. That is one death roughly every 40 seconds. So if you or someone you know is struggling, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net/hope. That resource is going to be right in the description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this. There you'll find resources that include the National Suicide Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. You can also text HELP to 741-741. We also have a plethora of other resources, including churches, getting connected with counselors, LGBT resources like the Trevor Project, and also veteran hotline as well. Please, if you hear nothing else in the show, understand that you listening to this right now, have value and worth. We get it. Suicide, depression, mental health, these are hard topics, and the stigma around them doesn't make it any easier. But please consider the resources right in the descriptions below, wherever you guys are listening, because once again, you have value and you have worth. So please stay with us.
The episodes to me that had a very Mighty Mouse feel to it.
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
especially with the music and the like heavy trumpets, like dun dun dun, dun, like definitely like that's kind of where I was going back to with the whole idea of we want this hero, we want this person defending everyone, and a lot of the cartoons back then were all about like highlighting the protagonist, and the sound effects kind of are very much like, if you were to take the sound effects out and put it behind Mighty Mouse, it probably would have worked perfectly.
Very bombastic.
Yes.
But what see, and this goes back to what I was saying about anime, what I personally found watching some of those episodes was that it reminded me of Mighty Mouse, but like a deeper Mighty Mouse. Again, a lot of the villains were like, at least from what I remember from those cartoons of that era that I've seen, and I haven't seen a lot, like the villains are very one-dimensional, and they're kind of humiliated and beat up and thrown in jail cell at the end, and it's, it's kind of like, yay, we won, it's the champion hero won. But I saw several episodes. There was one episode with the hooligan who hated robots and wanted to destroy all robots, and he had this huge gang and everything like that, and spoiler alert for this episode. I mean, it turns out that his mother was a robot, basically, and he thought his mother was killed by robots, but it wasn't that. So we try to make this show spoiler free, but I had to spoil it to give that example for that episode. So those kind of like more depth to the villains and more, forgiveness and mercy and innocence seemed to be much more present to me when I was watching these episodes than what I remember from shows back then.
I really appreciate that, I think, and I think it definitely defines like the difference between a lot of what we grew up with versus, I guess, this is that you look at like old cartoons back from like Hanna-Barbera days and all of that, and they're, like you said, it was very black and white, like, oh, this is a bad guy, he's a bank robber and he beats his dog and he's trying to trick the good guy and he doesn't learn anything, and it's always the same thing over and over and over. But then you look at this, and just from watching a couple episodes, you're like, a lot of these villains are like misunderstood and are capable of learning, are capable of change. And I think that's really important to differentiate between a lot of like Western versus Eastern culture, at least in the cartoons that were technically made for kids. And there's a lot more gray area that gets explored, I think, in Astro Boy in particular, just because it's not like, oh, this is something that's going to be misunderstood. It's like, oh, this is a bad guy. This is like, even Astro Boy himself, they're like, oh, he's a robot. I'm not taking orders from a robot. He's bad. He's a robot. And while we know better, it like explores people like learning. It explores the whole idea of, oh, we thought he was bad, but he proved us wrong. We are capable of change. We are capable of growing. And I think that's like super important.
Like in the first episode in the 1980 series, like Dr. Tenma and Astro Boy are on a ship and they go to dinner with just some people. And then at one point, like, I think like Astro Boy drinks something and then like something squirts out of his head. And then the woman they're eating was like, oh, a robot. and then she's like, I thought you said it was your son. And then everyone in the dining hall is just like giving Astro Boy these mean looks. And then later in the episode, Astro Boy ends up saving the ship when they almost crash into an iceberg. And it's like, he's a robot, but I just misunderstood. It's like, oh, robots aren't bad. He's a good boy.
Yeah, and that it carries through, I think, all the way through the 2000s series, because as like I did watch all of them, it's definitely the whole idea of technology is bad. Technology is, they are excuse the turn of phrase, they are our slaves. They are these beings that do what we want them to do and nothing else. And they're scared a lot of the fact, like, oh, they're thinking for themselves. He's capable of like evolving, he's capable of feeling, he's capable of making his own choices. Like, this is scary. And that's like a really big like idea that kind of follows all the way from the 60s through the 2000s series is the whole idea of just because they're robots doesn't mean they're bad. Just because they're capable of change doesn't make them bad. Like, we got to accept them. Like, even in the 60s ones, like, straight up the Doctor, he's like, robots are a living thing too. And I'm like, but also, I get where he was going with that,
Yeah, the robot rights, I guess, is a theme throughout all three of them. One of my things in stories, I love when we just kind of get right into the story. And the first one, the 1963 version, I love because they just set up everything in like a half hour. Like, yep. Like, because he's basically, like you said, he's sold into slavery in a circus, which I'm going to circle back to in a moment because I have a question about that. But he's sold into a circus, and then by the end of the episode, because he rallies the robots in the circus to basically save the humans from a fire that starts, that robots are awarded like rights. Basically, they're awarded rights, so that kind of ends his slavery, and he then gets the job there. But it's carried throughout still in this 1963 series. I know there's an episode where another character is struggling, with finding out he's a robot, and there's a lot of this like you said, fear of robots, fear of something different, which projected to a lot of groups and a lot of throughout the world in our society in real life, and is also seen a lot in other forms of pop culture. I mean, X-Men was, obviously a great example of that too. So it's the same kind of similar thing here. But I think once again, it's just, that's what I love about anime. It just, it presents it in such an emotional, X-Men, while they're punching Magneto and talking about mutant rights, you're kind of like, oh, okay, that's what they're really talking about. This one doesn't hide it. I didn't find it hidden or anything. It's going to be right out there about the fact that we're talking about fearing something that's different than you, or fearing something that's a new experience or something that is maybe more powerful than you. And that was, I thought, a very interesting theme that they did there. But going back to the circus, since you two are my guides to anime, what is with, for the 1963 version, what is the deal with the butt plugs?
What?
Do you know what I'm talking about here? The scene in the 19... There's this is what stopped me from getting into anime for a little while, was scenes like this that I would stumble upon. There's the scene where he meets a robot that's basically not allowed to recharge, and so he's becoming deactivated. And so Astro Boy's like, I'll give you some of my power, and which was fine. I'm following it. And then the robot proceeds to pull down his pants and bend over for him to plug in and charge him. Why?
No.
I think that's just probably Japanese humor where they're like wouldn't it be kind of funny if that's how we charge? He had to pull down his pants.
I can't say that I know the exact reason why, but I mean, thinking from a technological standpoint, if you had something. Okay, I'm gonna logic this out.
You're gonna try to make this realistic.
I'm gonna try to make sense of it. Okay, so logically speaking, if you had a doll that you had to plug in and you needed to make sure it was safe from the elements because it's an open circuit, they had little waterproof pants you put on them. I can't imagine anywhere else where you would have a safe exposure-free area where you could have a circuit. It makes sense if you want to think about it like that.
No, thank you. That actually helps a lot, because that now no longer bothers me.
Okay, good.
That makes perfect sense. I'm totally okay with it now. See, now
it didn't even faze me. I was just like, huh, all right. And then I just continued.
Did it faze you, Graham, or was I the only one fazed by this scene?
I think I didn't think about it, but then when you mentioned, I was like, wait, butt plug? I'm like, huh.
You're right.
And then I was like, oh, well, when you put it like that, I was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. You made an argument.
Maybe that just shows how deep we are in the culture. We didn't even think twice about it.
Yeah, that's probably because I'm the newbie.
Yeah, Matt's new to this stuff, so he's just I'm very confused, and we're just what? And then it bothers you, so then we're wait a second. So we have to pause and think about it from another point of view. Oh, maybe that is different, huh? But okay, just to talk for half a second, Naruto. It's if you ever saw where it's the jutsu and he's just sneak up on him. It's a prank type of thing, but it was a very different type of, I guess, situation. But it was just a funny haha, and I don't think there was anything to think about that. It wasn't something anyone paid much attention to. And I mean, look at all the other things, especially in our American culture from our cartoons. There's a lot of things looking back on it. You're oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. How did they put this on TV? There's a lot of things that have been addressed and corrected since then. But there's just, I don't think a lot of people think about it especially when it's so long ago, and it's especially it's a new type of media. So yeah, let's just explore and see what people think is funny. Let's see what people are interested in. Sure. And I don't think anyone thought anything of it, but now that we look at it, we're huh, interesting.
Yeah, I tend to overanalyze too, so it could just be me. But thank you. Like I said, Danny, you did help me out. So you have so far fulfilled your role as guide to my anime very well for me.
Good.
Because I am still fully on board here. I as like I said, I went to film school and I'm a writer, so I definitely, like I said, when I watch something, I look for what are the techniques that are being used, what's the point of the story, which we talked about. One of the major themes was acceptance, which definitely came through. But I saw some visual stuff that, was there too. I saw them doing a lot of pans and zooms, a lot of cinematography, which was astounding to me because this stuff was, probably only about 30 to 40 years old, even in live action films in Hollywood. So to then, translate that to, animation was kind of cool to see for me. And of course, the big eyes. I saw the big eyes, which are, I know, very well known in anime, although not all anime has that. That apparently I read came from Osama's watching Betty Boop. He felt that the eyes were all you needed to see emotion, which I agree with, actually. You always say the eyes are, the window to the soul. So that was why he used that. So I saw that in there. And I saw a lot of recycled clips, which came kind of like weren't integrated too well. I don't know what you thought. I didn't think they were integrated too well. You could tell they were recycling them in like the 1963 version, especially. But I know that's done a lot in, even modern day anime. So I thought that was kind of interesting that something kind of so obvious was then kind of utilized to make an art form kind of and make it something different.
Yeah, those budget constraints had to make them get creative, like you can see it especially in like Hanna-Barbera stuff, like we mentioned earlier. And then I know another big anime that's infamous for having to find creative workarounds, budget constraints is Neon Genesis Evangelion, like where there'll be like one full minute where like nothing's happening on screen and people are like
yelling.
Did my DVD skip, or like is the screen down? Like two characters are standing in an elevator and there's no talking.
Oh my gosh.
Like 30 seconds, and then and you're like, wait. Is this Frozen?
Yeah, that reminds me a lot of like Pokemon, where you would show their eyes and they would be looking at each other and be like blah 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 back at each other, but their mouth would just stay open, or they just wouldn't be like moving.
Yeah.
It's like they couldn't talk and move at the same time, so they would just, it was the same kind of idea, and I noticed that a lot, especially with like the movement of the characters in the 60s version. Like you see like there's like little dials and knobs in the science area. I don't know, the laboratory, yeah. Yeah, and it's very repetitive, so it'll be like a dial going left and right, and the person that's working the controls, he's going left and right, and it repeats that for maybe like 7 frames when you think of like current anime and it's a lot more detailed. But of course that wasn't the biggest excitement about this whole 60s thing. Wasn't so much in the details, it's about the story and the ideals that kind of were behind it. But knowing what about lower like budget films and lower budget like cinematography, and especially because everything was done like on slides, it wasn't on a computer like it's most of the times done now. It's a lot of reusing the same thing over and over, but they did it in a way that it didn't really, I don't think it took away from the story.
No, and Astro Boy itself, like I said, I kind of noticed it. It's still, you got the story across. And it's funny you mentioned Neon
Genesis Evangelion.
There you go. But we'll cover that. I'll get it down by the time we cover that in our series. But I remember when I was in high school, before my college days, and I was exposed to Adult Swim, I saw some Dragon Ball Z. And I noticed that they would be doing that. Like because I would be over a friend's house, he would have it on because he would be a fan. As we're like getting ready, or I'm coming back to do something or whatever. And I would just see it, and I would be like, we'll be doing something else. It's on the background. And I'm like, look, so I'm just glancing at it, because anytime I see a screen, I have to glance at it. It's a problem. But I'm keep glancing at the screen. I'm like, wait, what's going on over here? Because I'm not really following the story, but I'm like, these two characters have just stood there. And 20 minutes have passed. Like, what happened here? And that was one of the things that kind of turned me off from this. I was like there until I watched Inuyasha, which we will be getting to this season. And I saw Inuyasha, and I saw them just standing there, and I was like, oh my God, now I understand it. It's like building up tension. It is building up dramatic power, and just I feel like this energy now between them. Like I'm on the edge of my seats. Like it just sucked me in, actually. So it's funny, like you said, something that was, the mother of creativity, right, is a shoestring budget, because to save money by doing that and using that thing that was just recycling footage, now it can be used to build up so much dramatic tension and so much to pull you so into the characters and just make you edge of your seat. It's just amazing to me. But yeah, Astro Boy didn't do that, I think, as much to build up tension to my recollection, at least the 1963 version.
Nah, definitely budget fueled.
Yes, it felt like it was to fill time. It felt like it was to fill time. But it didn't interfere with the story either, like you said.
How would you guys like to help us get mental health resources into schools, conventions, and other events? Well, now you can. Simply go to patreon.com/victims and villains for as little as $1 a month. You guys can help us get mental health resources into current and upcoming generations, educate and break down stigma surrounding mental health, suicide, and depression. And you get exclusive content that you can't get anywhere else. And you guys can tell us which Nicolas Cage movie you want us to cover, and we'll do it. All it takes to get started is to go to patreon.com/victims and villains, or simply click the link in the episode description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this episode. Pick your tier and get started today. Yes, it's that simple. So quickly select the tier that you want and help us get hope into the hands of the depressed and the suicidal today.
Since we all saw all three versions, did anyone have a favorite? I honestly couldn't pick a favorite.
I was just going to say they were all good for different reasons. I think the original, the 63 version, was very raw. It was, they weren't holding any punches, and I appreciate that. But at the same time, when you watch the 2003 version, you can tell that we're farther into the future. Like, obviously it's not, oh, we're in the 2000s, cars can drive themselves, now, we're recording this or we're drawing this out in 2003, and now the future is something that we can, I guess, evolve a little bit more and kind of get a better idea of what it could be. And it also, I think it's a lot more relevant to issues today, like the issues that they're dealing with, because like I said, the whole robots, this and that, like it pulls it through completely, but I think it focuses less on the robot perspective and more on the different perspective. Like, you're different than me, I'm not used to this, the fear of the unknown, something that a lot of us now can relate to, either now or in our past. And I think it's a lot more lucrative in the way of, I think more people will find it relatable than maybe the 60s version, not to mention the graphics and get me started on all the animation and music and there's a lot of parallels going on, like in the 2003 version, you've got this parallel between Magnemite and Astro, like, wow, people, and you're seeing, this was one of my favorite scenes. I know it's not the 63 version, but one of my favorite scenes in the 2003 version is that you're seeing two different situations, I guess, go back and forth. So you're seeing Astro Boy exploring, and he's like, wow, people, wow, water, oh, look at these animals. And then in between each of those, you're hearing, the fear. Oh my gosh, Magnemite's overriding the controls. He's detaching himself from the grid. He's over, and it's showing the two extremes, I think, back to back to back, like simultaneously exploring the extremes of the worst possible scenario and the best scenario. And I think it's showing that there's a lot more gray area between the two. And then, you learn that maybe not all bad guys are bad. Maybe they're just misunderstood. Maybe there's something that they couldn't get across. Maybe there was some sort of miscommunication. Maybe they, there's just so much room to explore. And I think it's a lot more in depth in the 2003 version than it was in the 60s, because I think there's just more to explore at that point.
And there's some of that in the 80s version. So there's this character that's basically like the mirror version of Astro Boy, and his name is Atlas. Mm-hmm. And he is created Count Walper. Count Walper stole the blueprints from Dr. Tenma that were going to be used to make Astro Boy, and he made his own version of Astro Boy with his own kind of creation added on top of that. And he's almost like he's like Astro Boy in every single way, but he's kind of like the evil version of Astro Boy when he's kind of learning. You can't really be a person unless you do like we show you to do. There's these negative influences that are shaping him to be this way. You see how he turns out compared to Astro Boy, who's got all these good people around him to like help lead him to become a good person, and he has good moral background. And then Atlas just doesn't have it, and then you can see glimpses of like what he could be and what he can be from this other character, this other robot that serves the Count, called Livian. She's like the maid to the Count, and she takes care of Atlas, and she is this like very supportive, like emotional figure for him. He's kind of conflicted about everything he's been told by the Count and everyone else that has been an influence on him. And then Livian is like in complete contrast to that. At one point, when he actually meets Astro Boy for the first time, he gets into a fight with him and he tries to destroy Astro Boy, but then he remembers something Livian said to him, and it makes him stop and really question, is this what I need to be doing? She's kind of his voice of reason, and then he stops and leaves Astro Boy as he was and doesn't destroy him. So seeing that kind of parallel of like, I know I might be looking too deep into it, but just nature versus nurture, since you're otherwise identical.
Yes.
That I thought that was really interesting.
I didn't get that far on the 80s version just because I kind of took a particular liking to the 2000s version, so I watched a bit more of that one. But that's interesting. I was going to say, yeah, it's the whole nature versus nurture. When you have the two almost nearly identical, like twins, and one was raised by the loving, positive, encouraging parents versus maybe the one that taught to only follow orders, taught to not think for themselves, taught to like negatives, and just the fact it kind of shows you what Astro Boy, like you said, could have been if he wasn't raised correctly, or if he ended up staying with his creator instead of the doctor. It shows you the possibility, and it kind of makes you appreciate his character a lot more. And even the fact that I think it's important to highlight the fact that he stopped himself, like, it shows that he, too, is capable of learning and changing. And even though he might not have made the best decisions in the past, he can grow from them. And, he can take things he's done and kind of let them make him better, because he could have killed him. He could have attacked him or whatever, but he chose not to based on those experiences. And I think that's kind of like super powerful, that something that the newer Astro Boy didn't really cover, like, to that degree. But I appreciate that. That's cool.
I think we also have to, because all three of them deal with this slightly differently. But Astro Boy's kind of key to the origin is the fact that, like I said, he's created to be a replacement son of the scientist. And in the 1963 version, basically, if my memory serves, correct me if I'm wrong, but the memory serves me, in 1963 version, basically a scientist finds out his son is dead. He says, I'm going to build a robot replacement. He builds Astro Boy. He starts teaching him stuff and takes him home and everything like that. And then and he's, treating him like a son, and Astro Boy's developing. But then he realizes he's not growing like a boy should. Yeah. And he basically flies off the handle, says, you're not my son, and you're just a robot.
He sells him.
And he sells him off into slavery. For lack of a better term, into the circus. And that's the origin of the 63. In the 1980s version, it's extended a little bit where he does that same thing, but instead of getting upset about him not growing, he gets upset because he's kind of destructive. He doesn't know his own strength, but he still tries to work with him and make it work. And he kind of gets embarrassed at that dinner scene that you mentioned, Graham, in the cruise ship. And when everyone's staring at him, and finds out he's a robot, and he kind of says, you're not my son, you're just a robot. And then he goes and tries to find him and apologize. But by that point, he's kidnapped by the evil circus ringmaster.
The Dr. Tenma's a lot more sympathetic in the 80s version, because He spends a little bit more time bonding with Astro Boy. Then the fact that he didn't sell him off, Astro Boy just kind of runs away after Dr. Tenma kind of explodes on him. The circus master finds Astro Boy and manipulates him into joining him. And
he signs a contract, but he's like,
he says,
has no right.
He's like, what does this mean right here? Where it says, like, it basically says something like, yeah, like forever, like that I own you forever. And then he's like, just go ahead and sign.
Yeah, it's fine.
And I mean, whether he's either a robot or a kid, he's like both. So like either way, he should be signing a contract.
This guy's just so evil, and they make him like he's unlikable in like any version you see him in. In particular, I think it's really messed up in the 60s version. Just to kind of round back to that really quick, because literally these essentially children, I know they're robots, but they're children. They think, they have the mindset of a child. They're like, you stop being popular and you're a goner. Like, there's nothing wrong with them. They're not broken. He literally says he refuses to feed me. Mm-hmm. They say he refuses to feed me. Like he's neglecting his children. And I'm just sitting there like, this is really sad. Like, I know they're robots. And, like, they're not going to die from starvation, but they got low power, and they can't move right, and it's awful. It's so messed up. Oh, my gosh. So, like, I have a special type of hatred for him in the 60s version.
Yeah, he's a pretty dark character, and I don't think he's really in the 2003 version, from my recollection. But, yeah, he's a pretty dark character in both versions. But, yeah, I agree with you. 1963 version, honestly, took it to some darker places for being the older one. With the circus was one example. And there's a episode, I don't know how I stumbled on it, but where they go back into the Wild West. And they're literally the doctor, the detective that's with them, I forget their names, and Astro Boy are literally standing under a noose about to be hung. Like in the old West. And I'm like, wow, okay, children's programming.
Well, also when you but that's the whole idea. The whole thing about anime coming over from, that whole other country is that maybe their idea of children's programming is very different from ours, and it does show people that, hey, like, they're cartoons, but they're not necessarily always meant for kids. Mm-hmm. Just like you look at the guidelines for rated PG, PG-13, like the same things. You look at Europe and they're fine about nudity. Nudity is fine, nudity everywhere, but certain cursing or certain, things that completely take it out. But then you look here, it's like, oh, you can't show any nudity, otherwise it's rated R, Also the 70s. Any 70s movie you ever watched, it was PG-13, but there's topless girls. Things change with the audience and over time, and I think that's a great example is stuff that I don't think anybody now would be like, yeah, that's totally appropriate for kids.
No, that would never. There are some things in the 1963 Astro Boy that would never fly. And you look at it even in fairness, even to Western stuff. I mean, you look at some of those older Disney movies, Pinocchio, Snow White. I mean, they were not what Disney would put out nowadays.
They were dark and racist, and there was a lot of bad things happening.
Like, especially with the stuff with Atlas, when he shows up at the ship, the reason he's there is to make the ship sink and like steal the valuables that are on it. Earlier, when he's testing his power, he blows something up, and like there's definitely a person in there, and then at the end of the episode, or he ends up like making the Count drive his car off a cliff, and it's like, no, he definitely dies. They show the car wreck that Astro Boy, Toby, Dr. Tenma's son, who Astro Boy ended up basically becoming a replacement for. They show like the rubble, and Astro Boy's dog is like sniffing the hat that he was wearing when he was in the accident. It's just like, oh my God.
It's like Futurama all over again. It's just pain.
Jurassic Park, yes. Oh, my heart ripped in two during that scene. And they don't even go back to the dog. I'm like, come on.
But later on you do see pretty dark. Yeah, I do think that I'm glad that the whole basic idea that started in the 60s one gets kind of brought all the way through. And I'm glad it evolves the way it does. Like the 2003 version, I found it just way more relatable, like I had said earlier, and the whole idea of misunderstandings and forgiveness and, you know, growing from, like, you might think something about someone like Magnemite, like the bad guy in the first episode, you know, you might think this, but he like forgives him and everybody's forgiven because, oh, like, you didn't know what you were doing, or you were in a state of, you know, blind rage or blind, you know, panic or whatever. It's the whole idea of forgiveness, and I think it's very important to kind of take away from, because I see it a lot more in the newest Astro Boy than I do in the older one.
And I think some of that goes back to like what you were saying earlier, where it's like, it's the 60s, everything is very black and white.
Yes.
And everything is very just like straightforward, and it's speaks for itself. And then there's like, as culture has changed over the decades, there's all these like gray areas and further depth that kind of get explored. It was like, it's not just always the villain. It's, oh, there was a misunderstanding. He's not a bad guy. It's this thing that caused him to do this.
Yeah, and then, but you do have the characters though, like the detective, you know, he only is okay with Astro Boy when it suits him, because, like, honestly, from the beginning, he's like, it thinks for itself. That's dangerous, you know? And it's kind of the whole idea where he saves his butt later, and he's like, oh, well, I've got my eye on you, and he's just looking for reasons. I mean, of course, I didn't watch the entire series. Maybe there's character development, who knows? But from what I saw, it's just he's always looking for a reason to blame Astro for what's happening. And, you know, I feel like it kind of shows, like, whether, like, even though there is that gray area, you're always going to have those people who are thinking in black and white, and it's highlighting that particular person, you know, that exact person who's like, oh, this is black or white. There's no middle ground. And sure, he might have accidentally done something good, but he's bad, and, like, deep down, he's going to do something bad. He's going to lose control, and we're all going to pay for it. And that, I guess that's like a little remnant of the black and white past from the 60s version.
Yeah. I will say, though, I was most impressed with the portrayal of grief in reference to the dad in the 1963 version, actually.
Agreed.
As much as it kind of comes across as odd when you know, for at least for me, at least when I first watched it, you know, because in the 1980s version, like I said, the last time you see the dad, the creator of Astro Boy, like, he's calling out for him on the cruise ship, trying to find him to make amends. So he's left a lot more, you know, like, okay, I snapped at you, I'm sorry, I'm going under distress and everything like that. And in the 2003 version, he kind of goes
crazy, angry, and like dark.
Yeah, he like wants to take over the world or something like that. So I don't know what they did with that one. But in the 1963 version, I thought, you know, it seems irrational that he's like, well, you're not growing, so get out. I'm selling you to slavery.
Yes.
But,
yeah, he's a jerk in that version.
Right. But when I thought about it, I was like, you know, that's a good representation of grief, because when you're in the throes of grief, deep grief, especially at the beginning, you know, you're not thinking with a rational mind. Your irrational world's been kind of jumbled and severed. Especially, you know, I mean, I know like when I lost my dad, I mean, for the first like 3 days, I really have like no real memories. You know, I was just kind of a zombie walking through, just because I was adjusting to the new reality. You know, I didn't know of a reality without both my parents. And the same thing when I lost Buddy, who was my dog. You know, again, I knew I was going to most likely outlive him, but it was still a reality adjustment of just, he had been with me for so long, and he was such a big part of my life, and such a focus that, you know, now my life was different, and it was trying to cope with that reality, and things were being pushed out, and I was not rational, you know, for a little while there, always. And I can't imagine to have the grief piled on to, you know, for a child, where you do expect to outlive them, and or I'm sorry, you expect them to outlive you. You know, you don't expect to have to mourn them at any point. So I think his irrational thought, you know, that he kind of goes through the stages of grief almost, that, you know, of sadness at first, and then, you know, denial when he tries to build the robot version, and assume that that's his son again, reborn. And, and then the anger, when he kind of realizes that his son is really gone, was actually portrayed rather nicely in the 1963 version.
I really appreciated the whole illogical aspect of his, like, don't get me wrong, he's a terrible guy and he's horrible, and whether or not it's because of that, whatever, but like taking it apart and not judging him on anything before or after, I think his grief and the way he, one of the first things he says, he's like, nobody's resting until this happens, and he's gonna live forever. Like, that whole idea of this wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to live longer than me, essentially forever in a parent's eyes. He's supposed to live forever until my forever. So I pass away, he's going to pass away, but I won't be there to witness it. And I think something that it kind of goes through is, like, it does have similar aspects to the newer Astro Boys, but, like, he's too strong and he's, like, kind of trying to learn, and he gets frustrated with him, but that's not what does it. That's not what eventually is the final straw. He's essentially learning. He's growing as far as, like, mental capacity. He gets lost in the fact that he's in such denial. Like, he believes it's his kid, and he goes, "I've been a good father. Can't you be a good son? Can't you be a good son and just grow?" And he's, like, sobbing, and it's really sad because it's not Astro's fault. Obviously, he's a robot, but he still has feelings, and he's essentially guilting this robot for not growing, but in his mind, that's his son. And he's in denial, and eventually he loses it. And, like, he essentially lost it. Like, don't get me wrong, in the beginning, but then he, like, takes a step back and has himself together a little bit until he realizes, no, he's gone forever. And that's when he just completely derails. That's something that you don't see in any of the other ones. Like, you see a lot of emotions, especially from, like, Dr. Tetsuo or whatever. Like, you see those emotions and the regret and, I feel bad for this or that. But I think the loss is something that, I know everything's a little darker in the 60s version, but I guess I didn't expect it to get so real. Like, that was kind of intense.
He sells him. Like, that is pretty dark.
He eventually is like, "Oh, well, you aren't my kid. Bye."
But I didn't think about this till just now, but the fact that, like, he does it after he's like, "Oh, you're not my kid." Like I can't even have this in my life as, like, a reminder of my son. I, like, out of sight, out of mind.
Oh, and he's like, "Father," and he's like, "I'm not your father." I'm just like, oh God.
I'm like, leave him alone. He didn't do anything.
Right.
And he calls him dad or whatever.
God.
He's like, "You're not my son. I'm not your dad."
And I think something that I didn't realize until just now either, I think the idea, and this is very 60s, the idea of having parents, a place to belong, it's kind of carried throughout the 60s version because, later on, the doctor, he's like, here's parents for you. What do you want? What kind of parents you want? Because, like, essentially, he wants to belong. It breaks my heart. Like, it's really sad because he doesn't have that mother or father because he's a robot. So the doctor, like, he's like, "I can make them for you," and I feel like that's, like, a big gesture and stuff. But, like, that whole idea of that you need parents is, like, very 60s. As someone who didn't really have parents growing up, like I wouldn't necessarily be like, yeah, that's the most important thing right now. Not, like, his sense of belonging. Like, you can have a sense of belonging without having a mother and a father that are biologically related to you. Like, 98% of the family that I consider family, we are not blood related at all. So, that's a very 60s sentiment, I think.
Yeah, I think in the 60s, it was more nuclear family, blood family. So that sentiment was there, to be orphaned or have it. These days, yeah, you're right. I mean, I don't really have much blood family in my life either right now. So, I think, people have started to find family, where they can more so. But yeah, here in the 1960s version, it's definitely all about getting parents, and I think he even gets a sister, right? Astro Girl.
Yeah.
Eventually,
he gets, like, for Christmas, he gets given a sister. Like, that's cool.
So it's very nuclear family oriented, which I know. I mean, Japan's a very, a very family valued country too. I know.
Very much more so than America.
Yep.
Yeah. So there you go. Yeah. I was gonna say you guys probably know more than I do. So
They're more kind of group oriented, and America's more kind of individualistic.
Yeah, it's all about providing, like, even if you have like $1 left, you're going to provide it to your mother before yourself. Like, because these are your elders. Like, they put a lot more value on elder and like the people who raised you, and the people, they come before you essentially. And like, that's the biggest disrespect, is if you don't follow that whole ideal, if you reject them or you dishonor them in any way. That's like the biggest bad thing that you can do, basically, at least in the Japanese culture, from what I've understood, and a lot more so, especially in like traditional, like maybe 60s type of time. It was a lot more, I guess, highlighted back then. I guess it was that was just like it was a foundation, a building block of the culture.
Which really makes that in 1963 scene that we were talking about, where the father is kind of having his denial that he's used about losing his son challenged, and is rejecting this boy who just wants, I'm your son, you're my father.
Just wants to be loved.
It makes it all the more heartbreaking. I mean, it's a horrible thing that's happening. And like I said, I mean, I don't want to excuse what the father's doing either, but I mean, both of them are going through a lot of heartache there. And it's a very raw scene. Again, a scene that I can't personally recall. I mean, I guess Bambi's mother would be the closest thing I could think of to anything from that era or before that would be in Western animation, let alone even, children's movie,
Right.
So that's that rawness that I said just really drew me into anime, and is why I'm looking forward to being well versed in exploring this world. So that, I guess, unless you two have anything you want to add, I think that
I could keep talking forever, but I'm good. I think we'll drag it out too far if I keep talking.
Yeah.
Well, if anyone out there listening wants to add to the conversation, wants to, comment on anything that we discussed here, you can feel free to email Animind, the show, at animindpodcast@gmail.com. You can also email animindpodcast@gmail.com if you want us to cover anime series or a movie that, is near and dear to you. We're going to try to get through as many as we can. But, if there's one that really spoke to you, by all means, let us know. We'll try to get it in. Next episode, Danny, I'm going to let you introduce, because I think you're most excited about it, what we're covering next week.
Oh my gosh, Promare. Yes. Okay. So Promare is probably one of my favorite movies from the last 15 years as far as like anime goes. I think it's not only artistically beautiful, the soundtrack's amazing. Anything from Studio Trigger is phenomenal, but just the entire thing is a work of art, and I'm really excited to cover it. I've seen it probably about 15 times, and I'm probably going to watch it another 5 before we cover it. Finally an excuse to get my roommate to watch it. He's avoided it just because he's not a big anime person. But yeah, so that's by Studio Trigger. It came out, oh gosh, what year did it come out? 2019? 19?
I think 19.
I want to say it came out in 2019.
Well, tune in next week to find out.
I know, I'm getting too excited. I'll start talking about it right now.
Yeah, I know. Leave something for next week. But yeah, we'll have the official date for next week's when you tune in. So we'll get our notes together for it. But yeah, that will be the next episode. In the meantime, where can they find you two?
You can just find me on Twitter at Mad Shellfish.
You can find me on Instagram at Kittens and Caffeine.
Nice, I like that name. As for me, you can find me on human1nature.blogspot.com. And the 1 is the numeral 1, not spelled out. That's my blog where I put my writings and short stories and stuff. So if you want to check that out, you can also, it's probably when this episode drops, it probably will be shortly afterwards that Victims and Villains will be releasing a play that I wrote as well called Love's Passion as an audio drama. So check out that as well if you'd like. And for you listeners out there can also check, speaking of Victims and Villains, that's our parent company. You can check out our parent company, Victims and Villains, over at victimsandvillains.net. On that website, you can find links to our Victims and Villains Facebook page, Twitter account, Instagram, Twitch, and YouTube. Victimsandvillains.net also has movie resources, movie reviews, podcasts like the one you're listening to right now at this moment. And most importantly, it also has our mental health resource library, where if you're struggling with any kind of mental health issues, you can find resources to help you out and find support, which is the most important thing. So I think that will do us for our first episode of Animind. Until next time, keep both your mental health and anime on the mind.